Again, I'm James Cavuoto, the editor at Neurotech Reports, and I'm going to give a brief overview of the state of the neurotechnology industry and kind of summarize some of the things that have been happening in our industry over the last year. And again, feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. Jojo will be monitoring the room and will alert me if anyone has a question. And also feel free to use the chat window to send private messages, or if you want to send a group message to everyone online, you can do that as well. All right, so let's take a look at some of the interesting things that have happened over the last year in the neurotechnology industry. And these are some key headlines from our newsletter, the Neurotech Business Report. And I'm going to go into more detail about some of these. I'm not sure how readable this is, but a few headlines that I want to highlight that were significant news stories during the year. Number one up there on the upper left, we're talking about glial cell findings. This was a talk that was given at the NANS meeting in January. The NANS meeting, of course, was one of the last meetings to be held in person before the pandemic made us all go to Zoom. But this was in conjunction with an announcement by Medtronic that they had purchased a company called Stimulation. We thought this was a really interesting presentation and development in the industry. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that's important when we talk about the spinal cord stimulation market. Also, many of you are probably aware that we had presentations and more detail coming from two of the newer players in the neurotech industry that were launched by entrepreneurs, Elon Musk, his company called Neuralink, and Brian Johnson, his company called Kernel. Each of them in recent months have done kind of an announcement detailing their progress. In the case of Neuralink, it was a brain-computer interface technology that's been perfected, modified a little bit from a year ago when they first launched the technology. Brian Johnson, who we're going to hear from tomorrow, Brian will be our keynote and will be having a dialogue with us tomorrow morning, so that should be really interesting. He introduced the Flow headset, very promising and interesting brain sensing device using spectroscopy technology, and we'll hear a little bit more. We'll hear a lot more about that tomorrow and what it means for not just the industry, but for the research community and for the consumer neurotech industry as well. Needless to say, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on our industry as well as others. But one of the positive impacts, and there have been several, but one of the positive impacts is that we have seen neuromodulation companies devise new therapies. And there's a couple that have received emergency use authorization from the FDA, and a couple that are performing some significant clinical trials to use neuromodulation as a way to fight off the cytokine storm that accompanies serious cases of COVID-19. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Something that's happened just recently, DARPA has issued contracts for its BG Plus program for spinal cord injury, and awarded contracts to teams from UC Davis, from Johns Hopkins, and I believe most recently from Pitt. And we'll be hearing a lot more about that contract tomorrow. Jen French is moderating a panel devoted to neurotechnology and treating paralysis. One bit of negative news, a watchdog group called Public Citizen issued a report earlier this year claiming that there's been lax FDA oversight of the SCS industry. Now, of course, there's different viewpoints on that, and we're going to get into that. We're going to hear from Victor Krauthammer, who is a former FDA person who was a consultant to Public Citizen on that report. But it's also going to be a topic that we take up tomorrow, and I highly recommend that everyone sit in on our editorial roundtable. It'll be our first panel tomorrow morning, and the four of us from Neurotech Reports, Jen, myself, Jojo, and Jeremy, we're going to have a discussion where we talk about, how should the industry respond to reports like this, where there's truth and where there's things that maybe have been exaggerated. But at any rate, we're going to hear later from Victor. So it's definitely something that this industry has to confront. Burying our head in the sands is not the right approach, because guess what? The issue is the issue of device safety, and the approval process is one that affects everyone. So we'll be revisiting that later today and tomorrow as well. Up in the upper right, we had several articles about new technologies for modulating the brain and the nervous system. One of them, a technology called ionotronic implants. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Also, a lot of activity in the bowel and bladder neuromodulation market. In particular, two big players, Medtronic and Exonics, have gone head to head. Exonics, the new player, penetrating a market that was dominated by Medtronic for many years with its InterStim SNS, sacral nerve stimulation product. So now Exonics has a competitive product, and they've been picking up market share steadily from Medtronic. Of course, Medtronic's not happy about it, so they filed suit. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So there's a patent infringement suit going on between Exonics and Medtronic. In addition, Medtronic has introduced a new version of its SNS device, the Mini, which was really meant as a response to the battery-free Exonics device. Speaking of litigation, Nevro, another player in the spinal cord stimulation market, has been very active with lawsuits against Stimwave and others. Got an injunction actually against Stimwave, and there was also ongoing litigation between Nevro and Boston Scientific. So a lot happening on the legal front. Let's talk a little bit about what's the pandemic impact on the spinal cord stimulation market. It has been severe, and this is a recent data from our new report called the Market for Neuromodulation Systems, which is our first market research report post-pandemic. So much of the data you've seen from us in the past was all done before the pandemic. Well, guess what? The pandemic, which nobody really anticipated, has had a serious impact on the neuromodulation market, spinal cord stimulation in particular. And the reason, which should be obvious, I think, to most of us, is that spinal cord stimulation implantations were deemed to be elective procedures. And because of the fact that most medical facilities were overloaded, and really even to this day still are, it's had an impact on the scheduling of SCS implants. How much? Well, depending on the company, anywhere between 25 and 45%. Now, that doesn't mean that those sales are going to go away, because as Abbott has said, among others, is people with pain still have their pain, and so presumably and hopefully, we're projecting that by next year, SCS sales will return close to where they were in 2019, and then continue on a growth pattern in 2022 and the years that follow. Now, before we leave the topic of COVID-19, I mentioned before that several companies are looking at, and research institutions are looking at, the possibility of using VNS, vagus nerve stimulation, to alleviate respiratory symptoms, also to investigate counteracting the cytokine storm. And this is a seminal paper that was published earlier this year in the journal Neuromodulation, published by the INS, on the use of vagus nerve stimulation for treating COVID. So electroCore, one of the key players in this market. In addition, we've seen at least a couple vendors of phrenic nerve stimulation devices, Lung Pacer, for example, one of the newer players in this market, using phrenic nerve stimulation to help wean patients off of ventilators, which is very important in the therapeutic successful therapeutic regimen for treating this disease. Now, many commentators have also mentioned the fact that, hey, some silver lining on the pandemic here is that, well, a lot of patients have reverted to telemedicine to meet with their clinicians. Not necessarily a bad thing. So this might be a trend that continues even once we're out of the pandemic. And also there have been some regulatory impacts where regulators have enabled teleconferencing, for instance, for meetings with FDA. And these are things that could continue, and if so, make things easier in the future for vendors of neuromodulation devices. All right, I spoke earlier about the lawsuit between Medtronic and Exonics. It's a big one. This is the timeline. In November of last year, Medtronic filed a patent infringement against Exonics. And in response, Exonics in March decided, well, we're going to challenge these patents. And most recently, the Patent Trial Appeals Board has agreed to review 6 of the 7 Medtronic patents. The one that was not reviewed has to do with the rechargeable external devices. So that one will not be reviewed, but the other 6 will. Now, what's interesting here is that when the PTAB issued this decision in September, Medtronic put out a press release saying that, the Patent Trial Appeals Board upheld our patent, which was true for one of the 7. But if you had only read that Medtronic press release, you might have come away with the impression that Medtronic had won the lawsuit. Well, not exactly. Now, just because the PTAB says that we're going to review the patents doesn't mean that they're going to be disallowed. It just means that there's the chance that they could be. And similarly, just because Medtronic was able to win in one of those 7 patents doesn't mean that infringement took place. That's yet to be determined. So the point I'm trying to make here is a lot of great sources of information out there, citing news from companies, press releases, et cetera. But you can't always count on what you read, which, if you'll forgive me for making a plug for our publication, Neurotech Business Report, which is why it's helpful to rely on people who've been following the industry and understand the nuances involved. While we're on the subject of one thing I forgot to mention, and the key headlines, something you won't find anywhere else is this story about the demise of autonomic technologies. Wow. We're going to talk a little bit about this later on, but this was a company that was doing very well in the migraine market with a minimally invasive device implanted to stimulate the SPG. Well, unfortunately, the company went out of business, and it was a year ago we mentioned what happened to ATI. We weren't really sure. Well, now someone just mute me. Oh, yeah. I need to keep speaking. Loudon, thank you. If I'm getting boring, just let me know, and I'll speed it up. But anyway, this is a story you're only going to find in Neurotech Business Report. All right. that's the end of my plug. But to go back to this patent, really what's key here is the tined leads that both ANS and Medtronic are using in their SNS device. These tined leads are basically a way to anchor or secure that lead to tissue when it's implanted. So Medtronic's patent calls for the use of these tined leads. As I understand the Exonics device, it uses helical tined leads, which is a different approach. Sufficiently different? I don't know. And I need to caution everyone, I'm not a patent attorney, although I did stay at an Embassy Suites last night. But there are several patent attorneys. I think Joe Bird is on line with us, or if he's not, will be later on, from the law firm Maynard Cooper. Thanks, Jojo. And if Joe isn't online, he should be later on. So if you want more details from someone who's an expert on the subject, I'm going to recommend you talk to Joe. But at any rate, this is a case that's going to have, I think, big implications. My personal prediction, and please don't hold me to this, but my personal prediction is this is a case that's going to get settled. Maybe there'll be some cross-licensing involved. Maybe there'll be, and the reason I say that is because, Medtronic, clearly the large player in the market, wanted to put up some barriers to Exonics. They've succeeded in doing so. Exonics has had to spend a lot of money defending themselves in court, but guess what? They've had a successful IPO, they've got cash, and they're doing well. I think, Medtronic has had whatever effect they're going to have. And I think they're going to realize that there's going to be new players coming into the market, and rather than risk getting their patents invalidated, maybe it's best to settle. Now, that's just my guess, but we'll see how this plays out. All right, what are some of the other things that have been happening in our market over the last year? Well, a big acquisition that just took place in the last few weeks. IOTA Bioscience got acquired by a pharmaceutical company called Astellas. It's a $304 million deal. MagStim, this is a smaller deal, a company we're going to hear from tomorrow in the non-invasive session, but another small company called EGI, which had previously been purchased by Philips. Philips decided to divest themselves of EGI. And get out of the neurosensing space, unfortunately. So MagStim picked up the product, and now they have, in addition to magnetic stim, they've got TDCS, and they've got high-density EEG systems. We'll hear tomorrow from MagStim as to what their plans are with that technology. I mentioned Exonics. They had a very successful IPO. LivaNova did a deal with Verily, which is Google parent, on VNS for depression. So the depression market hasn't gone away. LivaNova still has FDA approval for their VNS device. It just hasn't penetrated in a big way, and maybe this will have an effect. I mentioned earlier there was an injunction that never served on StimWave. It had to do with high-frequency stimulation, spinal cord stimulation, and basically StimWave was just getting a little too close to Nevro's high frequencies. Speaking of StimWave, a big divorce that happened between their founder, Laura Perryman, and split up the company, what used to be called StimGuard. Laura took control of, was actually ousted by the StimWave board, and there's now litigation going on between StimWave, the current StimWave management, and the previous management. And StimGuard has been renamed Micron Medical. They are going to be competing in the bowel and bladder market with an injectable neurostimulation device. So anyway, these are just a quick rundown on some of the things that have happened in our market. I mentioned earlier that there's been new modalities for treating brain and nervous system disorders. A Canadian company called Panaxium, who presented here at the Neurotech Leaders Forum last year. I think it was last year. Maybe it was at the Bioelectronic Medicine Forum. I lose track. But very promising company coming out of Canada and Europe, using ionotronic stimulation. And the appeal there is they're using capacitive currents as opposed to faradic currents. It's a much safer and more effective means of neuromodulation. They've actually developed ion-driven transistors. So this is a technology we will be watching. This photo on the left here gives you an idea of the size of the device. A lot been happening with ultrasonic stimulation. Many companies now in this space, and it's a technology that offers a lot of promise as an alternative to electrical stimulation for neuromodulation applications. There's a research team at Rice University pursuing a magnetoelectric stimulation technology. I mentioned earlier that glial cell stimulation from Stimgenics, now part of Medtronic, very promising modality. A lot going on in optogenetics, including some commercial firms. But here's an interesting application of a hybrid device using both optogenetic and microfluidic technologies that came out of Northwestern University. And finally, most recently, a team at MIT pursuing mechanical stimulation. And their mechanical stimulation, I don't know if you can see it in that photo on the bottom there, but there's actually these little nanodiscs. We're talking 100 nanometers in size that basically can be activated and activated remotely. And when they're activated, they can mechanically stimulate the intended target. So again, these are all articles from recent issues of Neurotech Business Report, but promising new modalities. Been a lot of happening on the regulatory front, both in terms of FDA approval and CE Mark approval. The big one in the SCS field was Nevro's new Omnia device. Mainstay Medical, and we're going to talk more about them in a minute, or later on this morning, I should say, received FDA approval for the Reactivate device. They don't really call it an SCS device, but we tend to lump it in with the SCS market, even though in its strictest sense, it's a stimulation technology treating nociceptive pain. Medtronic got FDA approval for its Percept DBS system. That's something it's a closed loop type of therapy that they're pinning a lot of their hopes on for moving forward in the DBS market. Smaller company called Olympic Ophthalmics got approval for a device called iTear to treat dry eye. Bioness, a Southern California company, got CE Mark for treating fecal incontinence. So that puts them as yet another competitor in the bowel and bladder space. A European company called Aliva Neurotherapeutics got CE Mark for their DBS device called DirectStim. I want to talk a little bit about the FDA Breakthrough Device Program. But before I do, I want to just mention that we have in our room some people from MCRA who are experts on this, and I'm going to highly recommend, if you want to learn more about the FDA Breakthrough Device Program, that you have a chat with either John or Tim from MCRA. But just in a nutshell, this program was established a few years ago. It replaced the expedited access program that the FDA had implemented a few years ago. And it's a way to basically speed up and make more efficient the approval process. But even more exciting is that CMS, basically the federal agency that oversees Medicare, they have agreed to make it easier to obtain reimbursement or add-on payments if you're part of the Breakthrough Device Program. So getting breakthrough device designation is not only a boon to getting regulatory approval, but it's also going to help you out in terms of getting reimbursement or additional reimbursement through CMS. So that's a really exciting and promising development that's happened in the last year. Some of the devices in our industry that have received breakthrough device designation, Neuraleaf has got a non-invasive CES device for depression. Synchron, an Australian company, has a device called Stentrode, which is basically a BCI device that's migrated into the cerebral vasculature. Very interesting and promising device. GTX Medical, a company we're going to hear from tomorrow in the paralysis section, they got breakthrough device designation for their go-to product for treating paralysis. Helios Medical, a company that has a non-invasive or minimally invasive device called PONS for treating multiple sclerosis. Here's a new company, Noctrix Health, with a device for treating restless leg syndrome. And finally, Neuronetics with their NeuroStar device, which had already been approved for depression, now receives breakthrough device designation for bipolar disorder. So I think if you can see kind of a trend here is that the FDA is looking at new indications, particularly indications that haven't had a lot of therapies, where patients don't have a lot of choices. And if it's promising technology, that breakthrough designation really will help these companies. Lots of VC funding. Here's a sampling of some of the startup companies that have received VC funding in the last year or so. NeuroPace, of course, the biggest, got $67 million. And a company called Salvia, it's a Dutch company, got a 26 million euro round for their migraine device. It uses little conforming bioelectric strips that are implanted under the skin, minimally invasive device, but really promising. A San Francisco company called Presidio Medical got $30 million round for a pain device that they haven't said a lot about. So we did hear from their CEO, Michael Ackerman, a year ago when the company was just starting. Didn't have a lot to say, but I think this is a company worth watching. One of their investors is APVC, Action Potential Venture Capital. They've got a pretty good track record. Invis as well contributed to that $30 million round. A European company called Wise got 15 million euros and a Series C for doing a device. Really interesting call. They're stretchable leads, both for brain and spinal cord stimulation devices. The idea is these leads can be implanted percutaneously. And then once they're implanted, they'll function like paddle leads in an SCS system. Another company called Cardionomic got 15 million for its bioelectronic stimulation device for treating cardiac, using neurostimulation to treat cardiac disorders. Another company, EBT Medical, got $10 million for a device for treating OAB. Again, we're going to see a lot of new entrants in that market. Narova Lens is a European company, a British company that got £5 million for its device. I didn't mention Neuromod devices as I believe that's an Irish company, and they have a device to treat tinnitus, which they're using a tongue stimulation and a headset. Kind of an interesting approach. So tinnitus is a terribly debilitating disorder where there's not a lot of therapies available. So that's another interesting one. A local company called Rune Labs got $5 million for doing basically brain data. Brian Pepin, their CEO, will be with us tomorrow on our closing panel where we talk about the neurotechnology industry 5 years from now. Another Bay Area company called Hum got $2.6 million seed round for doing their consumer TDCS device. So a lot's been happening. This is just a sampling of some of the funding activity. So pandemic or no, there's a lot going on. This is like a quick look at some of the key clinical trials going on in our industry, or trials that have just recently been completed. Also, there's some new faces, new CEOs in our industry. The biggest, of course, Jeff Martha, the new CEO at Medtronic, just recently took over as chairman of the board. Keith Sullivan is the new CEO at Neuronetics. Dave Marver, we're going to hear from tomorrow, is the new CTO at GTX Medical. R.A. Bruneau is the new CEO at StimWave, and Mark Landy at Micron Medical. Really quickly, we're going to be talking about SCS later on in a session that Jeremy Koff is going to moderate. But I just want to put this up there to give an idea of what's been happening in the SCS market. The original form of spinal cord stimulation was tonic stimulation of the dorsal column. Started actually back in the 60s by the very early Earl Bakken, the founder of Medtronic. That technology got perfected, but it was still basically tonic stimulation that was used, until later on Nevro decides, well, wait a minute, what if we use high frequency stimulation and we don't have to have paresthesia? Paresthesia refers to the tingling that a patient feels to replace the pain. It's not a noxious feeling, but you're aware that it's there. And Nevro came along and said, well, wait a minute, you don't need this. We can have paresthesia-free stimulation if we use high frequency. And they're using about 10 kilohertz stimulation. And guess what? You get superior results. Well, a few years later, a new company called Spinal Modulation, which later got bought by St. Jude, which of course got bought by Abbott. They came out with dorsal root ganglion stimulation. Or what's the deal there? Well, you can precisely target a specific area of the body, a toe, a leg, a foot, and you can more precisely deliver the therapy. And guess what? Superior results. Well, now 5 years later, along comes an Australian company called Saluda Medical. And they said, well, wait a minute, we can use closed loop stimulation. Instead of just turning on the stim and seeing what happens, let's turn on the stim and then see what the response is. So they've got a biomarker called ECAP, which is an evoked compound action potential, which is indicative of how the stimulation is affecting those neurons in the spinal cord. And based on that ECAP, they then modify the stimulation. So that closed loop stimulation is not only more efficient, because you're not wasting energy, but you're also producing superior results. So those are all paradigm shifts. And then this year, we saw a company called Stimgenics introducing its differential targeted multiplexed technology, where we're not only able to stimulate neuronal cells, but we can stimulate glial cells, which respond quite differently. The receptors in the membranes of glial cells are different than those in the neuronal cells. So guess what? We use different frequencies. We use different waveforms to stimulate both the neuronal and the glial cells. And it might be restorative. It might be we can restore this pain network to its normal state. And guess what? The initial results have shown superior results to everything that's preceded it. So, it looks like every 5 years we're seeing a paradigm shift. It could well be that this Medtronic DTM technology is the latest paradigm shift that's going to upend the SCS market. It is getting crowded in the SCS market. I mentioned we've got Medtronic and Abbott, Nevro, and Boston Scientific. Saluda has European approval, but has not yet received FDA approval. We expect that someone's going to gobble up Saluda. They've already turned down some offers. Medtronic has invested in this company, but thus far, Saluda has fended off their overtures. It could be another player that ends up buying Saluda. Not to say that there's not room for 5 major players in the SCS market. Maybe there are, but we're still expecting that Saluda is going to get acquired. Could be by player who's not yet in the market. Maybe it's J&J, maybe it's Stryker, who knows? But we will see some new players in the pain market. Now, on top of what's going on in SCS, we've also got peripheral nerve stimulation vendors. StimWave, I mentioned before, Nalu, Bioness, SPR. These are all companies doing peripheral nerve, and we're going to hear more from some of these companies later on. Same thing going on in the bowel and bladder market. You've got sacral nerve stimulation vendors, Medtronic and Exonics right now. New Sparrow will be a new player in that market. But we also have peripheral nerve stimulation vendors, Micron, which was StimGuard, Bioness, FemPulse, Blue Wind, doing stimulation of the tibial nerve to treat OAB and other urinary disorders. We lost a few companies in the last year. eNeura, most recently, a company also in the migraine market that had a single pulse magnetic stimulation device. Unfortunately, that company went out of business despite the fact that the therapy seemed to be working and the patients were happy with it. We're going to talk more about this tomorrow. What do you do? What do you do when you have a therapy that the patients like, that's working, but the company goes out of business for financial reasons, or in the case of ATI, for funny business reasons that have nothing to do with the effectiveness of the therapy, and the patients want to keep the device, but the company's gone. What do we do? We're going to talk about this as a panel tomorrow morning, so I recommend everyone sit in on that. Nexion is a company that had, was trying to pursue a DBS device, was trying to pursue a device for competing in spinal cord stimulation and in bowel and bladder stimulation. The full story's not in on them yet, but they're gone. Second Sight announced that they were basically closing their doors. But the pandemic might have breathed some new life into them, because they have recently said, well, wait a minute, we still have a trial going on. So Second Sight, which is developing a retinal implant, hanging on by a thread, we're not sure whether they're going to survive or not. It is a public company, and they do have a market cap, but, not looking good for them. I'm going to leave you with some noteworthy quotes during the year. This is referring to that issue that I just talked about. This is a researcher who is using the ATI device, commenting in the journal Lancet Neurology. Patients have unnecessarily devastating attacks because simple spare parts are unavailable, and no one, including clinicians and neuroscientists, discusses this problem in the literature or at scientific congresses. Well, I want to correct Dr. May, because we're going to talk about this tomorrow. Here's a comment from Doug Weber from Carnegie Mellon, or now at Carnegie Mellon, formerly Battelle and Pitt. After Elon Musk gave his video with the pigs, which I'm sure most of us saw, while Neuralink's Gertrude was hogging, Gertrude is the name of the pig, while Neuralink's Gertrude was hogging everyone's attention yesterday, our friends at Synchron had big neurotech news to reveal. And what he's getting at here is, hey, wait a minute, Elon Musk is getting a lot of attention. He's a big player, make no mistake. We're fortunate at this year's Neurotech Leaders Forum to have two former Neuralink employees on our agenda. Flip Sabes will be on our closing panel tomorrow, and Vanessa Toulousa is going to be on the panel devoted to BCI. So you don't want to miss that one tomorrow. ASPN, American Society of Pain and Neuroscience, just held, literally the day before Election Day, they held a series of debates on some great topics. But Tim Deere made this wisecrack comment about the mainstay device. He said, make the multifidus great again. It's kind of an inside joke, but I thought that was noteworthy. All right, so I mentioned these are some of the things we're going to be talking about in upcoming sessions. We're going to talk about funding. We're going to talk about what lessons we could learn from neuromodulation failures, talk a little bit more about the SCS market. We have a great session tomorrow looking at the non-invasive stimulation, magnetic stim and other forms of non-invasive stim. We're going to be talking about translational entrepreneurship. Jojo Platt is going to be moderating a session that highlights some of the key research institutions in this country and their relationship with commercial activity. I mentioned Vanessa's participation tomorrow in a session devoted to brain-computer interfaces. We're also going to hear from the chairman of, or the president of BlackRock Microsystems, which has been involved in the BrainGate program for many years. And then also Jen French is moderating a panel on new therapies for treating paralysis. So these are some of the things coming up. Looking forward to it. And that wraps up my talk. I think I went over a couple minutes. Happy to take any questions.